Yes, he is.
I'm going to sit in the see the screen.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think we will start the last session now so that people can have enough time to rest tonight and prepare for the conference the next day. We are going to talk about a relatively new subject in the last session. Professor Salam Alshareef will be presenting on China-Middle East relations, a site for the transformation of neoliberal international order. Salam is assistant professor in People, Organizations and Society Directorate in the School of Management. He has recently published 2 peer-reviewed articles about China's Belt and Road Initiative in the Global South. He explores the geopolitical implications of China's Belt and Road Initiative activities and its challenges to international neoliberal order, using China-Middle East economic relations as an example. This is a relatively new area of interest, as close relations between China and Middle East were almost unthinkable just 10 years ago. Is this going to be just a short-term shock to the system, or is it a historic moment in geopolitics? This is a question maybe Salam can provide some answers to. After Salam's presentation, we have Ellen Freeman and Michael Roberts to give their feedback. Ellen was a principal economist with the Greater London Authority from 2000 to 2011. He's now retired and lives in Canada, where he is co-director with Radhika Desai of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. He was also the translating editor for the 2-volume book of Professor Cheng Anfu, a famous Marxist in China, on the theory of value, as well as being on the steering committee of the World Association for Political Economy and the editorial board for the World Review. Michael Roberts is joining us from Zoom. He is an independent researcher, a Marxist economist, author of several books, including Capitalism in the 21st Century Through the Prism of Value, The Great Recession, The Long Depression, and Marx 200. I think many of us here are keen followers of his blog as well. Thank you to all 3 speakers, especially to Salam for accepting the challenge to explore this under-researched subject, but it's also very important in shaping today's geopolitics. Over to you, Salam.
Thank you, Samki, and thank you everybody for being here and online. So my presentation aimed to contribute to the debate on the determinant and consequences of Chinese international rise, China international role as crystallized by Belt and Road Initiative. We will take China's relation of Belt and Road Initiative in West Asia, Middle East as an example. The main idea methodologically of my research is that the process of the transformation of international order is partially embedded territorially in specific regions and specific markets, works in the domain of the international political economy rather focus on Chinese economy itself, on China relation with big blocs like United States, Europe, etc. So the objective here is to focus on specific territories in terms of markets, mainly energy market and the Middle East. The focus of our study indeed is the transformation of international neoliberal order rather than the relation of China-Middle East. We will focus on some elements of a China-Middle East relation that demonstrate the process of transformation of neoliberal order. And just methodological note, since the beginning, how I understand neoliberalism in my work, it's Marxist understanding, neoliberalism is not seen simply as an ideology as it's generally accepted, but rather an expression of crisis of overaccumulation of capital, especially 50s, 60s, which necessitated an expansion of capitalist relation of production, commodification of partially commodified sector, in core countries, and at the international level, it aims to recalibrate the global space of capital accumulation. The global space of capital accumulation was fragmented due to the result of the World War II. So neoliberalism is not only understood as economic phenomenon, but also as political and geopolitical phenomenon. Conceptually, the objective is to contribute to an understanding which unify political and economic factors, something which became very hard in academia due to separation between economics and politics, and to understand the unity of economic political factor at different geographical scale, from the local to the global, passing by the regional and the national. So the debate about China is kind of difficult at the West for several reasons. One of the reasons is that the Chinese experience and experimentation, ongoing experimentation, hold many new elements, rendering many of classical concepts simply obsolete. In addition, we have an ideological battle in respect to how to frame Chinese rise, okay? And within this ideological battle, it's not a surprise that dominant class ideology is dominating. So China is rather seen as a threat. And recently we have seen the rise of the recuperation of anti-imperialist rhetoric as culminated by the debt trap strategy narrative. And even critical voices are forced to scrutinize and study this ideological narrative. This is an example of how the dominant class is in a position to define the territory and the contour of ideological battle. Even when you are critical, you are criticizing, including my work. I'm criticizing some dominant approach in global political economy, even if it has a Marxist format. Especially among Marxists also, we have the same, especially Western Marxists, not all of them, but the mainstream, we have the same political conclusion as the right wing, as the bourgeoisie, but with different dictionary, with different concept inspired from Marxist tradition. So for David Harvey, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative is not new. There is nothing new under the sun. It's simply a special fix. It means it is the result of crisis of over-accumulation of capital in China, and we have a geographical expansion of capital overseas in order to valorize obsolete capital at the national level at the external geographies. So he puts on equal foot Belt and Road Initiative capital flows with new liberal flows from core countries. Here, what should be noted that this perspective is not founded on empirical research, okay? Empirical research, serious one, now are restrained in some Western universities, especially Deborah Broughtingham from Job Hawkins and Boston University in Germany. There is a group of researchers who demonstrate and who criticize indeed the mainstream vision about China. What we should also highlight that in this Marxist vision that David Harvey, indeed one of the most important representatives, we have an understanding of capital with big C. What does that mean, big C? That there is no variation of functioning of capital through different scale, and especially there is no consideration of the possibility of socialization of capital by a specific set of social forces in specific countries who can regulate and who can capture the mechanism of capital, and China is one of ongoing example, where is a tentative, an attempt to recapture. I can't say that there is a complete capturing of a mechanism of capital of China, but there is a clear attempt to capture the mechanism of capital in order to achieve a set of specific socio-political objectives. So the central thesis of my presentation in political economic terms is that Belt and Road Initiative is for sure based on a crisis of capital overaccumulation in China. And this is publicly indeed recognized by State Council in China in different documents, that we need to find valorization for excess productive capacity, for excess reserves, etc. But Belt and Road Initiative can be reduced to a profit-driven expansion of capital, and that the Belt and Road Initiative constitute a political attempt to give coherence to the de facto international economic role of China and to mobilize these capital flows in order to respond to a set of political objectives and economic objectives situated at different geographical scale, from the local to the national. So in discussion with David Harvey, the paper that was published in New Political Economy argues that, in contrast to special fix of United States, which was constituted mainly of private capital and was accompanied by a neoliberal offensive at all scales, the Belt and Road Initiative is mainly a state-owned or directed transnational capital flows, accompanied by an effective revision of international neoliberal institutions. While the United States special fix left whole areas in the United States impoverished and deindustrialized, the Belt and Road Initiative attempt to address the uneven development within China through its strategic integration of the mainland underdeveloped region in the Belt and Road global circuit of value. And why the foreign policy or the territorial logic of power, in the terms of David Harvey, Arrighi, and Anna Arendt, US foreign policy relies on military security and political and economic interventionism that mobilize balancing approach to create rival blocks and opposing blocks. The Belt and Road Initiative seeks to reduce vulnerability to the weaponized US-dominated global connectivity network, as well as to deleverage US balance of power strategy against China. So those are the main result of the research formalized in global political economic terms. Then there is the issue of how to frame and conceptualize Chinese international role and the effect of China's rise and international role on the international order. So we adopt the thesis that China's rise effect on international system is defined by its power-weighted national preference. How to understand the national preference of China in terms of its political economic model? What is the political economic model? Here we need the concept that permit to capture the specificity and the peculiarities of China's position in the global capitalism and the international division of labor, and in the global political dynamics in terms of geopolitical rivalries, okay? We need to highlight some elementary ideas that global capitalism systematically produces advanced cores and underdeveloped peripheries with hierarchical dependency relations and with violent coercion by historical cores to attempt to escape peripheralization by peripheral countries. In this context, we adopt the definitions, the concepts that were developed by van der Beugel and even Madame Radica, which is contender state. China is considered as a contender state. Contender state in the sense it is a political economic model that prevail in later commerce countries in the periphery who attempt to resist a global hierarchy and who attempts to change their position in the international division of labor, going from low productivity and the primary sectors to a much more complex sector intensive in value added. The contender states are conditioned by two historical realities. The first is the existence of a more advanced core heartland state society complex, which around which the circuit of capital is established and to its interest indeed. And this heartland systematically attempted to embed whatever experience to escape peripheralization. The second condition is that is the domestic underdevelopment and the coincidence of several historical stages of development. So we have pressure from the at the internal side where we have underdevelopment and unhomogeneous social substratum. At the same time, we have an external pressure. In this context, the state becomes a subject of social development who drive forward the social formation. And the state itself is directed by a state class whose power resides in the hold of state apparatus. State capitalist class are present in the contender state and they are not powerless, but in the Chinese case, it is a Chinese state which is run by the Chinese Communist parties who has the power until now. Profitability and price mechanism are present as a driver of economic activities, but only as allocation tools among other tools which are being mobilized by state apparatus in order to achieve structural transformation. China is integrated in the global economy, but its integration is selective, is regulated, and is reversible. And more importantly, it gives China some leverage to transform the global system through its presence in the global market. And as Madame Radica have noted in one of her books, a contender state can be capitalist or communist, depending on the socio-political nature and orientation of state class who is holding the power. This is why I prefer to use this concept instead of state capitalism, because for state capitalism, the capitalism is the end of the history. So, at the same time, we need to refrain from an idealist understanding of contender state, in the sense class struggle is always present in contender state, and there is a possibility of a passive revolution to occur, passive revolution according to Gramsci, in the sense that capitalist power being constituted as an independent class, as a class for itself, and capture the power. Whether this will happen or not in China is mainly determined by the performance of its contender state socio-political model, but also by the performance of Heartland, the new liberal order, okay? And here we should highlight that in the last 10 years, the Chinese contender state has been consolidating after the crisis of new liberal regime of accumulation because social forces which are connected to a global neoliberalism were de facto and objectively weakened. Just one example, the trade surplus in China was halved between 2008 and 2018. It means that the importance of outside markets, especially core countries, were weakened objectively, and the link is weakened objectively. Combined with this, the geopolitical aggressiveness of United States toward China, this is cornering social forces who are for the new liberal order and for developing capitalist relation with the core countries. This is why we have seen in the last 10 years a consolidation of industrial policy in China, consolidation of the role of state party role in the economy, and the rising interest in social and redistributive policies, and more regulation on private capital in different sectors. So now we are going to see that the characteristic of Chinese contender state at the national level are reflected in Belt and Road Initiative activities as observed in the domain that we have studied in the Middle East, which are three main domains. The first is the direct access to oil through investment in downstream activities, and in investment in logistic and trade routes, and thirdly in Chinese activities in respect to oil-related monetary and financial arrangements, especially the question of Petro-Yuan. So at the institutional level, now I'm going to describe the point in respect to which we can see clearly the difference between Chinese transnational capital flow and the previous experience. The first idea is that different level of Chinese state are directly implicated in the Belt and Road Initiative capital flow, either through direct state or ownership, or through the role of different ministries, through the design of projects, the implementation of projects, and the financing source and mechanism. And even when the private sector is present, the private sector is trying to respond to some requirements from the central state level in order to be included in the activities of Belt and Road Initiative. For example, in respect to direct access to the oil in Middle East, it's a Chinese state-owned companies in the oil sectors who are active. We have also the presence of a Chinese Communist Party organization department and its enterprise committees in different enterprises. We should highlight here is that the role of Chinese oil state enterprises is the latest step in the transformation of the ownership of international oil companies, a process of transformation which started after the Second World War with the rise of national liberation movement. Now, the process is accelerating with the Chinese rise, and it is part of change of the global order. Then if we look to the project in transportation and logistic infrastructure, it is mainly Chinese state-owned enterprises. And even in the case of private investment, as it is the situation for Oman, for the industrial park of Oman, it is a group which is called Oman Wangfeng, which is building a 10 billion industrial park in Oman. And this enterprise is a subsidiary of China Arab Wangfeng Investment Management, which was constituted under the order and the leadership and encouragement of Ningxia Autonomous Region, which is one of marginalized region, as we are going to see that China try to dynamize its economy through its integration in transnational capital flow of Belt and Road Initiative. If we take the case of the Petro-Yuan contract, which was launched 2018, it is managed by Shanghai International Energy Exchange, which is a subsidiary of Shanghai Future Exchange, which itself is a part of Chinese financial market regulatory apparatus, which are working directly with the China Security Regulatory Commission and with the parties, with the Central Commission for Discipline and Inspection of Chinese Communist Party. So this is completely different than the structure of financial market in the core countries, which is completely privately owned. Still, the capitalist logic can operate through state apparatus. If the ownership is status, that doesn't mean that capitalist logic is not operating. Here we pose the question of how to distinguish between nominal and effective party-state control in the case of Belt and Road Initiative. The simple answer is that we take as an indicator of control the effective and potential outcome of the different activities of Belt and Road Initiative, and we try to understand whose interest it is serving. So, according to our analysis, we contend that the effect of party-state nexus is very clear in the activities. That doesn't mean that they are controlling all activities. This is a general trend. This is an attempt which is succeeding in some places, okay, which is not having some difficulties in other places, but there is a general tendency. So the first was the institutional design of Belt and Road Initiative, and now we go to the question of the potential and effective outcome of Belt and Road Initiative. The first observed outcome is that Belt and Road activities are designed and implemented in a manner that permit to address uneven development in China through the integration of marginalized, capitalistically marginalized region in the mainland and the transnational flow of capital within the Belt and Road Initiative in an attempt to dynamize their economies. And here it is not a coincidence that we have a campaign of propaganda in respect to Xinjiang in the western part of China, because this is a central part, a central node in the connection between China and the world economy, world market, and the experience there seems very appealing with several indicators about success of investment in many sectors by state enterprise. I forget its name, which is anyway targeted by US sanction under the name of repression of Uyghur, etc. This tendency is observed in the majority of projects that we studied in our article. As I said, in the case of Oman, it is Nigeria. For the trade route going through Turkey and through Iran, the central node connecting this country with China are marginalized region in China. The second outcome is that studied activities contribute directly to China's energy security in terms of direct access to oil and potentially less vulnerable transportation route, and in addition to the increase to the monetary autonomy in terms of invoicing oil transaction in currency other than the weaponized dollar. What we need to know is that China became the world's biggest importer of oil. Its oil imports dependency has increased from 50% in 2009 to more than 73% in 2019. So almost 75% of oil of China come from outside of China. So if we take the example of activities, Belt and Road activities in China, in the Middle East, indeed almost 50% of oil of China come from the region. The case of Iraq is very significant. Chinese activity in Iraq is very recent. It started in 2008. But in 2013, through investment through state-owned companies, 26% of 26% of Chinese overseas oil production was located in Iraq. So in 5 years, it went from 0 to 26% located in Iraq. The same in respect to a trade route and energy, in respect to trade route, the Middle East is central for the alternative trade route for China compared to those dominated by United States military apparatus. We can take the example of DOCOM. DOCOM is an investment in port and trains and an industrial park in Oman. It contributes to lessening dependence on the trade route dominated by United States. How? Here we have the trains route, which will be financed by Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. This figure is taken from the document of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which clearly declares that the objective of this train line is to expedite the flow of energy from Gulf producer of oil to DOCOM port to transport it probably through Gwadar, Pakistan, instead of Malacca Strait, which is dominated by the United States. Here we can see that DOCOM can become an important point for the transfer of resources from east of Asia, Oman, and then Gwadar, through Gwadar directly to China, Xinjiang, instead of passing through Strait of Malacca, knowing that Pakistan is the country #1 in respect to Chinese investment overseas. It has more than $60 billion. So here we see that investment in the region are connected with other part of the world in the attempt to diversify trade route. The same goes for Petro-Yuan. Petro-Yuan, the release of Petro-Yuan was motivated by decreasing Chinese dependence on pricing of oil on dollar. Because China needs an unconditional access to financial and payment infrastructure in a context where the United States is using its dollar as a weapon of sanction against its rival, what are considered rival power. We have seen that Iran was sanctioned. Iran was a source for oil for China. Now it has difficulties to access to Iranian oil due to this sanction. So concretely, Beijing launched Petro-Yuan contract, breaking dollars oil invoicing exclusivity. And what is most important is that the majority of oil which is deliverable with the Petro-Yuan contract is coming from the Middle East. It's coming from United Arab Emirates, from Oman, Qatar, Yemen, and the most important source is Iraq. Within a few, with 6 months indeed, the Petro-Yuan had an impressive success. It took 40% of the global activity in similar futures. So the second outcome of Belt and Road Initiative in activities in Middle East is increasing energy security simply through direct access to oil, through attempt to diversify a trade route, and through a new monetary arrangement to invoice the oil in order to avoid US geo-economic leverage. The third potential, not potential, indeed, it's effective outcome of Belt and Road Initiative in the Middle East, West Asia, is the restructuration of new liberal international monetary system. Indeed, if China wants to maintain its contender state model in home, China needs to restructure the global system in order to maintain its policy autonomy to apply its industrial policy and structural transformation strategy. So it needs an expansion of its autonomy in a context where core countries are increasing their pressure on it. And when we are speaking about the restructuration, it means the restructuration of the rules that are governing the international economic relation. So the Betroi One is an example of a territorially embedded arrangement which has the potential to increase, not the potential, which effectively increase China's monetary autonomy. In addition, it has the potential to restructure the international monetary system if the Betroi One is adopted more widely by other countries. It has not been too long time ago that United States is considering, not United States, Saudi Arabia is considering adopting other currencies than the dollar as invoicing currency, including Taiwan, not only Taiwan, including the renminbi. So, put simply, China relation with Middle East and the launch of Betroi One contract is a step in the restructuration of international monetary system and in the position of the dollar as a key international currency. So the fourth effective outcome of Belt and Road and Chinese relation with the Middle East is to foil US geopolitical maneuver. Here, I should note that Van der Pegel in his book affirms that confrontation is inevitable between the contender and heartland state-society complex, and that all contender states in pre-atomic era had to militarily confront the core state who enlist other states as a part of balance of power policy. And in all previous cycle of confrontation, the heartland prevailed over the contender state. When we are speaking about heartland, we are speaking about United Kingdom and now about the United States. And United States clearly 2013, launched 2020, I guess, 2012, launched the rebalancing strategy or pivot to Asia, where it has been increasingly using a geo-economic and geopolitical maneuver against China through trade wars, through sanctions against central partners, through the creation of opposing blocs and balance of power strategy, such as the quadrilateral security dialogue and AUKUS in the southeast of Asia. So Belt and Road Initiative necessarily seek to respond to China's dependence on US-dominated global connectivity network. And this is very clear in the case of Middle East, because China has the biggest stake in the resource that we have in the region. Indeed, oil from the region is not mainly going to United States, it's going mainly to China and to the east of Asia. But United States have very important and impressive military power presence in the region, and it can cut the flow of oil from the region. The same in respect to dependence on dollar and infrastructure, payment infrastructure. So it's not a coincidence that the Belt and Road Initiative was announced a year after the announcement of Pivot of Asia. And China seems modulating the flow of capital of Belt and Road Initiative within a geo-economic strategy that simply seek to foil pressure from United States through the creation of alternative, less vulnerable and less dependent connectivity network to the world economy than the current one, which is dominated by the US. This is clear in the region. Now China has direct access to the oil on region of the Middle East instead of being dependent on international oil companies based in the West or being dependent on Brent and Texas future contracts, which are based in UK and United States. The same for logistics, the same for the petrol one. And what we need to highlight here is that the Belt and Road Initiative could geo-economically counter US balance of power strategy as it focuses on a mutually beneficial project. This type of partnership, win-win partnership, would create an incentive to its partners to become increasingly differential to Beijing political preferences and to take distance from US attempt to enlist Chinese partner as adversary of China in a manner that permits China to leverage the balance of power approach of United States. And here, the level of participation of some regional countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Turkey, who are among the most important and fidel allies. They were not allies, they were client to the United States historically and participated an instrument for the United States to dominate the regional resources and geopolitical position and the struggle against liberation movement in the region in the post-World War II, which had a very important emancipatory potential. So politically, it is very significant what we have seen recently, the access of Saudi Arabia, of Iran, mainly Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates in the BRICS Development Bank. And today, we should highlight that today, the ambassador of Saudi Arabia to Iran entered to his office and vice versa. And this is one of the fruit of Chinese mediation of mediation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And we can conclude about this effective evidence about the difference between the Chinese international role and core countries' role, because Saudi Arabia and Iran conflict is not something that fall from the sky. It's something which was systematically fed by the United States after the Islamic Revolution, which took a critical stance vis-a-vis United States. Before Iran was Shiite, as we say, they were Shia, and Saudi Arabia were Sunnah, but they were collaborating together to the interests of United States. And there were no problem. But the question of Shiite and Sunni was brought on the table after that the position of Iran had changed vis-a-vis United States. And thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Salam. I will invite Ellen to be the first discussant for your session now. What's this?
Michael's here, isn't he? I can't see him, but I can see his self-description. So do you want me to go first or do you want Michael? Sorry.
You go first, Ellen. Yes, you're here. Michael, you don't mind, I hope.
No problem.
No problem. Okay, thank you.
Well, good to be on the platform with you, even if we're a few hundred miles apart. Yet again.
Yet again.
look forward to ending that soon. I should start by saying that this is a tremendously scholarly paper, and therefore I found an enormous amount of factual information in it, which is immensely valuable. And therefore I have to confess that I know far less than the speaker. And for that reason, rather than go into any of the factual issues, I want to look at some sort of, possible theoretical issues that it raises. And then even then my factual ignorance is so great that I'm going to raise a number of issues more in the form of questions for discussion, rather than something I definitely know or can assert. So if anything I say appears obviously wrong, please say so, because I'm sure your factual knowledge will trump my theoretical ignorance. There's just a minor point which I think is very important from the point of view of what kind of scholarship is now needed, which is the relation between Russia and China. Now, we've done a lot of work with a man called Sergei Glaziev. I don't know who is familiar with him. He is now minister in the Russian government for Central Asian integration. Eurasian integration, that's right. He's been so preoccupied with Central Asia that we've forgotten he has that wider remit. And one of the things that has been reinitiated as a result of his work, one is to hope, is the north-south trade route. And there's going to be a construction of a train line, which I think we'll now find is greatly accelerated, leading from the north of Russia right down to the Middle East. So the BRICS is no longer just going to be east-west, it's going to be north-south. And this also will be a fundamental transformation, because that same trade union intersects with Western Europe, intersects with Central Asia. So that, and also, of course, Russia is a Middle Eastern player, as Cyril tells us, so that when one is looking at the Middle East and one's looking at China, one should also look at Russia. The second thing is the basic question, which is why is what China is doing different from what the imperialists are doing? And you said many things, and I just want to try and frame it theoretically, which is this, that basically the premise of Chinese policy, it seems to me, is that there is a community of interest. That's not the premise of imperialism. Imperialism says, we are going to liberate you from your backwardness. That's the ideological message. So we're coming to bring freedom and liberty to the new world by exterminating all your indigenous people. We're going to bring India into the modern world by, depriving it of its industry and elevating its caste system into a system of government and communalizing it and splitting it in two. We're going to, bring China into the modern world by making it the world's biggest opium consumer, by breaking down the resistance of its ports to our ships coming in and doing trade with them. So and it's all justified in terms of these are backward peoples, and therefore we have the right to impose on them because we're superior. I don't see that in the way that China portrays itself in the international stage, and I don't think it is China's actual motivation, and I don't think it's in China's interest. So if there's a community of interest, one cannot just speak of what China's policy is towards Saudi Arabia. One must also ask, what is Saudi Arabia's policy towards China? And that I found a little bit missing. What's in it for Saudi Arabia? What's in it for Iran? And my answer would be the development of their economic sovereignty, of their people and their societies. So the ideology of mutual interest, it seems to me, is not just an ideology, but a real fact. But that's really one of the things that's very fundamental to investigate. The second thing is I'm always suspicious of this word overaccumulation. I'm sure it's being used very innocently, but I'm going to say three things which will antagonize pretty well everybody in the audience, although Michael will like it. I don't like the word underconsumption. I don't like the word overproduction, and I don't like the word overaccumulation. And here's why. You cannot tell what is correct. Do we know whether we are producing too much or consuming too little? No, all we know is we're producing more than we're consuming. What is over what? The real thing that's going on, it seems to me, is quite simple. It's not actually accumulate, and also it tends to signify an accumulation of private capital. Now, having heard your talk, I realize that's not what you mean, but in the Marxist what can you call it? Canon, overaccumulation refers specifically to a crisis of the falling rate of profit caused by a rise in the capital output ratio. And I don't think that's what's happening. What's happening is actually quite simple. Keynes would have understood it. China has a trade surplus. If you have a trade surplus, you will build up something within the country. You can call it capital, you can call it reserves, you can call it anything you like, but you will own foreign assets. You don't have any choice. That's just the way the accounts work, okay? And unless you wipe off the debt. What should you then do? Well, Keynes had a very simple proposal, which I think is progressive and correct, that the countries with the surplus should give that surplus to the countries that are not. And that will develop them, that will develop relations of mutually beneficial trade, and it will correct the imbalances in the world. So therefore, I think that for China to put money into other countries is not only an economically inevitable consequence of having developed its economy and therefore having a trade surplus, but it's actually morally correct. So I think it's a good thing, unlike, you know, capitalist investment in the colonies in the days of imperialism. So it's a good thing. And to me, it's just that it has a trade surplus. Then the question is the driver of the investment political or economic? Now, the history of imperialism was that the adventurers went there first. Clive of India, you know, Rhodes, bloody hell, you know, Columbus and his successors, you know, they went there not to seek the blessing of the state, not with the blessing of the state. And then when they stirred up so much trouble that they couldn't cope with it, then they called in the army. So the state only became involved. Up until then, they were pirates. And piracy was openly encouraged by England well up till 1800, and so France and so on. It was a method of inter-imperial competition with mutual piracy, and people would shoot it out in the South China Seas. So the role of pioneering the movement of capital was taken by private individuals. But the chart that you showed there conclusively shows that the export of capital is actually being undertaken under the initiative of the state, which is why there's so many SEOs that are involved in this. And the reason is, to me also, it seems entirely progressive, which is that if you're going to, in the mutual interest of the 4/5 of the world who is not living under imperialism, deal with the imperialists, you have to break their monopoly of trade. It's not just a military question. The primary instrument for control of world resources is not actually ownership, but control of movement of goods. And China learned this lesson very early in its history. I don't know, there's an island in China which I was taken to, which is being developed into one of these biggest port facilities in the world. Now, unfortunately forgotten its name, but they have a museum on the shipping history and the ports history of China. And deeply ingrained in Chinese consciousness is that the first step that was taken to their enslavement was to destroy their ports, because that you know, battered down the walls, the so-called Chinese walls, you know, the Chinese walls of actually having a monopoly of trade, which was destroyed by the imperialists. So to recover that, you have to create a world trade network to challenge the world trade network, which is actually currently dominated by the Americans. And by the way, the Americans had to do exactly the same thing with the British. One of the reasons the Depression was far worse in the USA than it was in Britain is Britain had imperial preferences. And they maintained trade with the colonies throughout the Depression. They actually had a rather good Depression. And America was in the humiliating situation where its own goods could only travel up and down the coast of America on British ships, which was an extraordinary thing. It's why the building of a fleet was one of the main objectives of Rooseveltian, Trumanian policy, was the building of a fleet, so that they, and the substitution of air power for naval power, so that they themselves could be the carriers of the world's goods. So I think it's entirely correct that China is doing this, and I'm very glad it's doing it with a new technology, the technology of trains, as well as the technology of boats. So I think there's a good political reason and a progressive political reason for seeking to break the monopoly of trade of the imperialists, and that's, to me, is a political imperative, not an economic one. So I think that the private capital is following in the wake of the state rather than driving the state, which is what seems to have happened under imperialism. Now, finally, then, it is different from imperialism, and the record of imperialism, one can say many things about it, but the question I want to ask is, does it lead the way to socialism? Now, I think it does. In fact, I personally think that I would rather call China socialist. And we have this strange debate with Russian policymakers because they say, well, I quite like the Chinese model. You know, I think we'll do the same thing, you know, rein in the oligarchs, state control of state monopoly of foreign trade, capital controls, all that stuff. And I say, well, you know, what you're talking about is capitalism with Russian characteristics. But the Chinese call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. I don't care what you call it. You know, any color cat matters as long as it kills mice, to use a famous phrase in Chinese political history. But if you look at what the imperialists actually do, if you use this criterion, they've taken countries which were evolving towards socialism and sent them back. And Afghanistan in 1970 had what was virtually a socialist revolution, you know, mass expropriation of land, very progressive policies, industrial development, immense intellectual progressive climate. And it was destroyed. The Americans deliberately developed, you know, everybody up until including Al-Qaeda, which they financed into existence. They threw it back into them. It was not a backward country. They backwardized it. So that's a horrible thing to do. Send a country 300 years into its past just because you don't fancy the Russians having a hand in it. Yemen was a socialist republic, you know, I think it was North Yemen, I'm not sure, North, South Yemen, was a socialist republic at one point. Look at it now, it's a death. Look what's happening in Yemen, right? Never mind Chile. And I think there are many African countries which by now would be socialist were it not for the general policy the imperialists have of assassinating anybody who's remotely dangerous, starting with Lumumba. Well, not even starting with him, he's just the most famous. So the imperialism positively sends people backwards. And not only that, the very interesting thing, Chinese policy, it seems to me, is to bring people together. So they bring Iran and Saudi Arabia together. The Communist Manifesto, not the Communist Manifesto, the 1924 Toilers of the East program of the Comintern, actually, when it talks about self-determination, talks about the right to unite much more strongly than the right to divide, because what the imperialists have been doing is carving everybody into tiny little bits, which they do with Yugoslavia, they want to do with Russia. Everywhere they want to rule, they divide. You know, if it were not for the imperialists, India and Pakistan would be a single country. The imperialists, Cyprus, Ireland, that's what they do. They disunite in order to rule. I don't see any evidence that China's disuniting. On the contrary, China's policy is to unite, which seems to me shows that whatever they're doing is of a different character. I'm interested in the policy of development, and this is the last point I want to make, because the ultimate thing for you know, Saudi Arabia particularly, but also for Iran, is they want to develop. And I get the impression that whatever else it wants, the Saudi wing of the monarchy, I mean, whatever, wants to develop Saudi Arabia. Well, you can't do that by an alliance with the imperialists, because all they want to do is rob you. They want to take your capital away from you. But it seems to me that there is an influx of money, there's an influx of resources into Saudi Arabia, and this will end up to the benefit of the Saudi Arabian people. I don't see how it could do otherwise. And one of the reasons for that is actually the Chinese policy towards technology. The intellectual property means something completely different in China to what it means in the USA, which is why America is so upset, because American IP policy since 1996 has been to promote blocking, what was called blocking IP. You acquire a patent, and the purpose of acquiring it is not to produce anything yourself, but to stop your competitors producing it. It's a monopoly. It's one of the many monopolies on which imperialism is based. Well, China's policy towards technology, at least within China, and this is why the question is interesting to me, has been that you have IP on something in order to make sure that people diffuse it. You even make it part of the legal obligation of the patent owner that the patent owner should diffuse what they've learned. And you grant rights to people on the basis of whether they think you're going to do it, which is very sensible, the same as granting rights to tenant farmers on the basis of whether they actually till the land or not, which was Zapata's policy in Mexico. So it's two different things under a same name. IP doesn't mean the same in China as it means in America. What I want to know is what it means in Saudi Arabia. Do the development investments in the Middle East seek to diffuse and transfer the knowledge and skills of the Chinese who are there to set it up to the local people? The impression I get from Africa as it is, that is, and you know, there's this famous, was it some African leader? I wish I could remember who said, when you talk to the Americans, you get a lecture. When you talk to the Chinese, you get an airport. You know, well, whose airport is it? Well, it's only going to be the airport of the receiving country, or it's only going to be the port of the receiving countries if you train the local workforce to the level where they can maintain it and where you can exit or be on some sort of equal basis. I don't know what are the relations of expertise and so on and diffusion between China and the countries which are recipients of inward going investment from it. So those are my questions.
Okay, Michael, over to you.
Well, I hope you can hear me all well enough. If there's any problems, shout. Sometimes communication on the sound and visual can be difficult when you're doing a Zoom. But if that's all right, let me start by saying that I think Salam's paper has made some really important points about the process of China's development and expansion of capital and credit to various parts of the world as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, but also in general as the process by which we're seeing the development of countries, some of the poorest countries in the world, getting the support, which of course, as Alan's already pointed out, far from getting support from the imperialist countries and from the agencies of those imperialist countries like the IMF or the World Bank, the opposite has been the case. The flows of capital out of the poorest countries of the world are more than 4 times as much each year than the aid and help being provided by the IMF, World Bank and other institutions, which I'll very briefly give some data in a minute. But that's an indication of the difference which this could make to poor countries around the world if this development process which China is engaged in succeeds in helping, and it already has done, as Alan has pointed out, and as Salam has pointed out very clearly in his paper. And I would take up the first point that Alan made, which I think, and Salam also emphasized, well, this is a different sort of export of capital than we get from the imperialist countries, or he likes to call it neoliberal capitalism. I'm quite happy with the word capitalism. And that we have a situation where the state agencies and the state enterprises are carrying out this process as part of really a political plan developed by the Chinese government, as we know, through dual circulation policy and the Belt and Road Initiative. This is not just big multinationals and other capitalist combines exporting capital looking for profit in the world where they can't get it at home, or to increase that profitability. And that brings me to the point about overaccumulation. There's one thing that jarred, I think, in the abstract and in the paper that Salam had to suggest that the reason for China's export of capital is due to overaccumulation at home. I know maybe some Chinese government officials claim that. Perhaps they've been educated in the Western universities. But those people who say that have misunderstood, as Alan's pointed out, that overaccumulation, as far as I'm concerned, is a specific process that takes place under the capitalist investment and production model, namely that it becomes overaccumulation in relation to the profitability that the big capitalist combines can make out of that. And that's not the way that I see overaccumulation, if there's such a thing in China. Contrary, you might say that what we have, can you really have overaccumulation of too many use values, of too many facilities, too many developments in technology? You can't have overaccumulation of use values of things that we act and services that we need. You can only have accumulation relative to the profitability for the private owners of the means of production and those who control the intellectual property rights and so on. And that's not the way in which I see the process that China is engaged in with the rest of the world through the Belt and Road Initiative and other capital. It's based very much on a state-centered and organized, as Salam pointed out very clearly, and therefore it is very different from what Harvey and others claim. That their view, of course, is that China is really no different. It's just another capitalist imperialist country like the US and the rest of the G7, and therefore it operates in the same way, and we get the same argument. So what Harvey would say, because he has a particular theory of crises, that all these capitalist countries have too much accumulation of capital and they must have it absorbed by the rest of the world. And China is just another one of those. I think that's a completely different model, and certainly not relevant in the case of China, as Alan and Salam, I think, will agree. And particularly, it's interesting to hear that he had a little bit of a debate with Harvey on specifically on this question. But the size of the process of the Belt and Road is worth mentioning, because I think I was looking at the data as far as I can get it up to 2020, and we find that China has built up a credit basis for its infrastructure investments abroad to the tune of something like $170 billion now. That's 3 times higher than it was in 2011. Throughout the decade, then up to the point of the pandemic, we've seen a threefold increase in the export of capital and the credit provided to carry out the projects which are in these various countries. And how do we compare that? Well, if we compare that with the 2 big international agencies for reconstruction and development aid provided by the West and the existing consensus order, then that 170 billion compares with the IBRD level of 204 billion and the International Development Association's 177 billion. So if we totalize that as the amount being applied to develop projects and other developments in the poorer parts of the world, the global south or the rest of the world outside of the G7, then basically China is now providing something like 1/3 of the total amount available. If it hadn't done so, we can see there'll be a considerable difference in the ability of countries to develop particularly infrastructure facilities and other measures, not just infrastructure, but also a whole range of projects which the Chinese state agencies through BNR have been engaged in. And I would say that quite often those structures, those developments, have not been in any sense profitable to Chinese state agencies that have been doing that. This is, as Alan said, and I think probably Salam can discuss, this is a political project and not specifically one just aimed at absorbing excess capital. In fact, I disagree with that view entirely. So what we have, for example, in the case of the Middle East, I was looking at the figures of the amount going to China that China has put into the Middle East. It's about 25% of that 170 billion in terms of credit. So Middle East is one. The biggest gainer from this is sub-Saharan Africa, as you might hope. So China's program then, as far as I'm concerned, is one in which designed, as Salam has said, both to gain a niche in support of getting resources and imports that China itself needs by building these infrastructures which enable it to, as we say, transport oil in Oman and elsewhere, but also to, as Salam has said, to develop an alternative a position against the position of imperialism and its agencies and control over the development of these global south economies, and in particular provide an alternative source of capital and financial support. And by that, China would gain political prestige and gain more support, as we're beginning to see in many parts of the global south. When we look at the question of whether China is the biggest aggressor in the world, which the Western media tells us it is in all their polls, when you go to look at the polls in the global south, the opposite is the case, that it's the US is regarded as the biggest aggressor in the world, not China. And that's partly the result of practical results that Chinese support financially and actually producing the projects that they're in those countries have achieved. One of the big Western media arguments is that China is actually putting these countries into a debt trap. And this is the big line, that they've got all this debt, they're now being charged huge amounts of interest on this debt, that China is then able to take actual ownership of the projects themselves and out of the hands of the domestic government. And as a result, it's operating in a completely imperialist way? Well, I looked through all the data, and there's a lot of studies now that have looked at the question of China's aid and support to these countries, and there is absolutely no evidence that there's any sort of debt trap going on or deliberate policy of squeezing these countries to death in order to gain control of assets in those countries directly. There is no Chinese ownership of any of these projects. These projects are held by the domestic governments. And where there has been serious problems with those governments being unable to perhaps service that debt that they've got with China, there's been quite a lot of writing off by the Chinese government of those debts or restructuring them and lowering the interest rates. That compares so drastically with what you see going on in a country, for example, like Argentina, which I've just picked out. But I was just looking at the figures that the IMF charges the Argentine government for the funding that it's given over the last decade. The interest rate for IMF debt in Argentina is 8.1% plus surcharge fees of another 2.5 billion a year. The interest rates, if Argentina had borrowed from the BRICS banks or from Brazil itself at home, would only have been 5 to 6%. And if they borrowed from China during the last decade rather than from the IMF, that would have been an interest rate of 3 to 4%. So nearly half what the IMF is now charging and is causing the huge debt buildup that we've seen in most of these countries. So looking at the debt buildup is just horrendous across the board now for most of the global south. The overall figure for debt to gross national income in 2011 for all the lower middle income countries excluding China was 26%. So 26, the debt was to the GNI was 26%. Sounds low. It's now at the end of that decade just on 42%. If you look at the debt ratio to exports, it's 92% in 2011 and now 154% at the end of the decade of the 2010s. So there's been a dramatic increase in the debt burden being placed upon the global south. And most of this debt is not coming from China. It's not being built up by China. China has still a fairly small proportion of all this debt. This is coming from the major G7 and imperialist countries and, of course, their agencies behind that. I was just looking at the Middle East too, specifically to relate to what Salam has been saying. It's even worse in the Middle East. The debt to GDP ratio in 2011 was 14%. Now, in the end of that decade, it was 38%. The debt to exports was 50%. 50% debt is in relative to the exports that the Middle East and North Africa is producing. Now it's 184%. That shows you the burden that is pressing down on the big poorest countries in the world. We now know that something like 60% of the lowest and poorest countries in the world are in debt distress. And this is not due to some debt trap plot by the Chinese, but simply by the size and loans and bonds that they've owe to various hedge funds and financial institutions and the international agencies in the West, with no clear indication that there's going to be any relief at all, or let alone relief, but even more importantly would have been cancellation of these debts. It hasn't taken place. If anybody's cancelled any debts over the last 10 years, these countries owe, it's been China that's cancelled them. At the moment, the IMF and the World Bank and other agencies are demanding that China join with them on a deal to relieve the debt of these countries. China has refused to join that on the grounds that basically the terms which the IMF and the World Bank and other private institutions want is totally unacceptable to the countries involved. It will just continue the burden if spread out over a longer period. So it's not joined that process and continues to work on its own. So in my view, what this shows is that far from it being anything like an imperialist economy trying to gain profitability through the export of capital because it's got too much of it or because it's not profitable at home anymore, this is a model which doesn't apply to China, and David Harvey and the others are wrong. What we have is a completely different model. Does that mean, therefore, we have a different economy in China? Well, Alan briefly mentioned that. In my view, yes, we do. This is not an economy that is primarily driven by the profitability of private capital of the means of production. It's not driven by profitability primarily. It's driven by the need to develop the resources and the skills and the use values, if you want to put it that way, of the economy, so that you can raise the level of productivity of labor and raise the level of prosperity of the Chinese people. What we're now seeing in the last half a decade, at any rate, is a move towards doing the same, at least to some extent, in the rest of the world, with the limited resources that China still has compared to the rest, the G7 and so on. This is a limited development. It can have some effect. And the real objective of the Belt and Road and the dual circulation is not the profitability of capital for Chinese enterprises, but to build development and relations with these poorer countries, so that China has some in certain protection or support from the surrounding forces of US imperialism that we're seeing developed over the recent period. You can use the word contending if you like, but I don't think it's quite the same contention as Russia's contending capitalism. We're talking about a different sort of economy, which is hoping to drive forward the poorer countries of the world as allies in the future, and also to strengthen its own position in defense against the US.
Thank you, Alan, Robert, for your intervention. In respect to overaccumulation of capital, indeed, I'm simply using it as an expression of excess capacity. We have, for example, some figures tell that 70%, the rate of use of capacity in aluminum sector, for example, it's 70%, and steel is 60%. According to my understanding, which may be limited to China, the law of value is still operating in China. It is captured by political power, which is trying to modulate and control the law of value to attain a specific set of social objectives. But my understanding is that it still operates there. This is why I'm using the term of overaccumulation of capital. Overaccumulation of capital in capitalist sense, within capitalist relation of production, which is, in my understanding, part of Chinese model, contradictory model, contradictory in dialectical terms, that they are Leninists, they are using a Leninist approach where market and capitalist relation of production are present, but the power is with the political level who is modulating the social formation step by step and bending to different level, different era, depending to requirement of different era. So maybe it calls for a discussion later whether it is overaccumulation of capital or what. Why China is different, and is it socialist or capitalist? So I think what is different is the core countries who are highly dependent on the rentier finance capital. A country like United States is one of the most, it is the most deficitary, who has the most commercial deficit in the global level, most indebted country. We see 3/4 of its importation are industrial products. Okay, so it's consuming which is produced by labor elsewhere. So I guess why China is different, its position in the international division of labor. It is a producing a labor nation. It's a workshop of the world. Majority of population are producing. Political system is trying to manage the development of the country toward the socialism. Is it a socialism or not? I will tell you, I'm not in a position that permit me to answer scientifically this position. I haven't worked on it very tough, especially because we have a lot of hole in the literature in this topic. First of all, we have many indicators of socialism in China. In the sense, we have productive forces which are being developed constantly. We have, it is the only place in the world where the share of labor is increasing. Indeed, one of researchers that we met with Thomas in UK made a research shows that the share of labor around the world is increasing. But if you withdraw China, it is decreasing, okay? It is the only place. The same for poverty reduction. So there is social indicators about social policy which are being implemented, and we shouldn't forget that there is a communist party in the power there. Okay, there is a communist party in the power with whole contradictions that the party have inside it. So, but the black box for me in respect to China is that what is the guarantee? First of all, we have law of value which is working, law of value which is captured by the political elite that we have in China, and which is being modulated to drive forward the development of China with socialism as an objective, as an official objective. But the black box for me is what are the conditions of the sustainability of this political power? Okay, I don't have answer. I haven't researched a question. We don't have the level of debate of the West. It's very low indeed. We are forced to debunk narratives, okay? At the same level, I guess the political system itself in China and the level of opening of China toward the world, they have different priorities, I guess, than our understanding of them. So,
before you leave this topic, can you explain exactly what you mean when you say that the law of value is functioning in China? What exactly do you take the law of value to be? I ask this because different people mean different things, and this is a very interesting.
Okay, the law of value simply is a production of value produced by labor and captured by capital. In China, we have mixed economy in the sense we have state-owned enterprises which have a central role in the economy, but they are not the only actor in the economy. I guess more than 50% of production in China is produced by private sector. And if we take the most advanced sector like technology, for example, artificial intelligence, etc.
So you only the extraction of value is the operation of the law of value, is what you're saying.
The law of value simply that labor produce value, okay, and
there are two parts to it. You are emphasizing one part,
and the other is the extraction to the interest of whom is the value being extracted.
The other is the mechanism of competition through which prices are forced down. This is just, I just want to ask, we can debate this. What I have said is not definitive. I'm merely.
I know, I'm doubtful in respect to competition, because competition, we are now in monopoly capitalism, and competition is something that we teach in the school, but what is happening in the ground in the global market, we have a few dominant monopoly transnational enterprises who are sharing part of market. So just what I want to say is that capitalist relation of production in the sense of ownership of capital, of ownership of what was means of production is still operating in China. I guess it's more than 50%, maybe 60% of the GDP of China is produced by private sector. For me, this is not sufficient to qualify China as capitalist. I'm not saying that China is capitalist, okay? I'm saying that capitalist relation of production is still operating in China. My last point was that we don't have a theory of socialist transformation. And theory of socialist transformation is by definition adapted to the specific context here, China. Okay, personally, I don't have it. Okay, but how we go from point A, which is capitalism, periphery capitalism, to point B, which is socialism. Here, it is sure within Leninist frame, there will be capitalism. And the more we advance towards socialism, the less the capitalist relation of production play a role. And even the official position of China, they are building socialism with Chinese characteristic. It's not yet built. So driver political or economic, I guess we do agree that the driver of Belt and Road Initiative are mainly political. Why Saudi Arabia, Iran going to China? I guess you gave the answer. It's simply the development interest of these countries. So two countries has different development model, Iran and Saudi Arabia. What is offering China? No other major economic power had ever offered during capitalist era. If we take the example of Egypt, for example, Nasser in 60s tried to 50s, Nasser of Egypt tried to develop relation with United States. He asked for a dam to build dam simply. It was refused, completely refused by United States, because simply the development of productive forces of this country will give them material ground for their political independence. So here you have China, which build a huge infrastructure never seen in the South. This is one of main interests. There is another issue of IP, intellectual property, and the transfer of technology. Indeed, I'm very interested in this topic. I made a lot of research in English to understand what is going on here. What's clear is that China and its development finance have a different position than World Bank in respect to the possibility to adopt industrial policy as a beneficiary country and impose some conditions that I need local companies to participate in the construction of specific infrastructure, to have a specific number of engineers in specific position to transfer the scale and the know-how in respect to the engineering projects. In addition, performance requirements in different cases were applied in respect to local sourcing from local producer. In the case of Angola, in case of Ethiopia, this was identified very clearly, but the main problem is the beneficiary country who doesn't have a comprehensive industrial policy and stable political power to sustain this project and put it in place, and to make measure and regulations that permit really to couple Chinese investment with dynamizing local production in a manner that Chinese products are not substituting local products. What also the size of Belt and Road Initiative, I didn't understood by Robert if it was a question, but it is something unprecedented. Between 2005 to 2018, the outflow investment from China, credit and investment, direct investment from China, bypass the whole credit from World Bank and IMF institution. Okay, in a sector like energy production, electricity production, it is bypassed also, surpass World Bank and whole Western development finance institution between 2005 to 2018. So it is a massive flow, something that we haven't seen before. I don't know if there are other questions that I didn't answer. The last issue, just for Saudi Arabia, and indeed, Saudi Arabia, I said it's different than Iran. Iran, there are different tendencies in respect to model of development. There are the new liberal degenerations that produce capitalist comprador class who are interested in the opening toward the West, and until now the West is promising that maybe there will be a deal, and if there is a deal, we will give Iran the position of a middle power between the East and the West, and this is a whole ideology in specific classes in which is present in power in Iran. Don't forget that Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran 2000, denounced the memorandum of agreement between Iran and China, okay, for free trade agreement. He denounced it. Even that with China, I studied Chinese free trade agreement. They are very shallow, and you can design it in a manner that you gain developmental benefits. Okay, Saudi Arabia. Before Saudi Arabia, there are another tendency in Iran around the Khamenei, which is clearly called for what he calls a resistance economy, which is an economy self-dependent, developing productive sector, calling for development of relation with anti-imperialist country, etc., etc. In the case of Saudi Arabia, I'm not specialized in the issue, but I surveyed and I read a little bit on the question. Until now, it seems that their vision in Saudi Arabia 2013 is rentier in its logic. It's focusing on tourism, okay? It's focusing on logistics, situating Saudi Arabia and global flow of capital to capture some of that value through logistics activities. It wants to build a new futuristic city, but I'm not sure that technologies that will be implemented there are developed in Saudi Arabia. They are contracted to Western
social development projects. Do they have a concept of social development, education?
The first step that they did indeed, it is the Saudization of the labor, because until recently, until now, the majority of labor power is foreigner. And the Saudi were dependent on a socially redistributive system of oil revenue, and they didn't participate massively and to important level in labor force. Recently, they started to Saudize the labor market, but at the same time, we have seen new liberal social policies which are being applied with a culturalistic opening, with which is directed toward the youth. It is a young population. At the same time, you apply socio-political social policies which are new liberal, you apply an cultural opening, which is good in Saudi Arabia to do that, but until now they refuse to call the Ministry of Culture Ministry of Culture. It is Ministry of Entertainment, and entertainment here, I guess, it's very significant from political point of view. It's for entertainment, while you are applying continue new liberal policies, you know, and there were a debate about this word, culture or not, or entertainment ministry. That's all.
Yes, I think we really don't want to overrun too much. Do anyone have any burning questions? Okay, one burning question, Philip.
I have a question about, this is a fascinating topic, but I'm thinking more about the perspective of like countries like Saudi Arabia, which are deepening ties with China and yet preserving ties with the US. Right? So, you know, what do you think of the hypothesis that some countries are using this geopolitical competition to enhance their own sovereignty, right? So, and so this is why they're kind of flirting or playing with both rather than, you know, putting all their eggs in one basket. You know, obviously Iran would be an exception because Iran doesn't have good ties with the US, but I mean, countries like Saudi Arabia, but also other beneficiaries of the Belt and Road Initiative. Is there any evidence in your research that this is part of their calculations?
For sure, indeed, in the region, one of the keywords which is adopted in Turkey, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, who are allies of United States, client to United States, diversification of international relation. Okay, it is an umbrella word to say that it's no more only United States and Europe. We are going to develop relation with Saudi, with China, and I guess it is a question of autonomy because during neoliberal era there were an important, I guess, even within capital, there were some conflict because when you are putting state aside, reducing the size of the state, bureaucracy, capitalists who are related to the bureaucracy and whose position is dependent on their position in the bureaucracy, got some risk and they have some resistance to this type of policy in some countries. Saudi Arabia, for example, it took time. It didn't, until now, it is a country economy which dominated by state companies, okay, state companies which are around the family who is ruling the country. So the question of autonomy for sure, but it's not the only question. Indeed, China, it is the only rising market simply. It's an expanding market where United States, UK and Europe in an existential economic crisis indeed. And they are managing with the magic of printing euros and injecting liquidity in the market. For how long that this will persist? Don't forget, we had crisis 2007, 2008, and these countries, Gulf countries, have a huge investment in financial market. Adam Haniya, one of the researchers on the question, estimates that there are $6 trillion of investment in UK and New York and United States generally from the Gulf countries. So crisis 2007, 2008, they probably lose and get burned by this crisis, some of their investment. And they understand that we should diversify our portfolio in this case. So there are economic factors related to development, related to profit-driven logic, but the question of political economy, no doubt, is one of central reasons. And indeed, in the recent period, we have seen a rising activity by a country like Saudi Arabia, who is starting to play a role, an independent role from United States, which is clear in the case of Syria, for example, where United States is very clear, have a position. Syrian conflict, we couldn't completely set the cows there. It is under freezing situation. So there is an attempt, different attempt by Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates and other countries to make some movement, okay? Until now, we are not clear whether Saudi Arabia is capable to go completely against United States in a case like Syria, okay? But anyway, they affirm that we don't have the same position. We don't have the same position. Going from not having the same position to implementing another vision about the political process in Syria and how to find a solution to it will signify a huge change.
Thank you very much, Salam. I will invite Dick to come on stage to conclude our workshop today. Thank you very much, Salam, and all our discussants today. Ellen and Michael, you guys have been great.
Okay, I'm going to be brief in trying to summarize what we have done. China and the future of the future prospects for the global South. I believe this is the concern by all of us for our participation in the workshop to date. Now, I myself try to approach this from a comparative perspective that is concerning what lessons from China or what model China has built up in terms of the political economy of development. And I try to put this in terms of the orientation and the capability of Chinese political economy put to the severe test of the pandemic. And we are going into details in that I try to summarize some distinctive characteristics of Chinese political economy that are not just China specific, but they could offer important lessons for the rest of the world that could have been adopted for coping with the pandemic crisis. Indeed, it might even be possible to claim that if the rest of the world, or in particular the advanced countries, did take the similar action early on, coordinated, cooperations, concerted actions in the early months of 2020, that the pandemic could have been avoided. That is a strong claim, but it is possible that if we look at what happened in China in the next 3 years, or to put another way, right, the Western establishments tend to claim, or at least implicitly assume, that the pandemic was an unavoidable, inevitable natural disaster, right? And therefore, what we can do is to live with the virus, right? That unfortunately is also the view of many people in the left that try to argue that we need not do anything to cope with the pandemic, or indeed they were strongly against all the different attempts to cope with the pandemic, the tracing, distancing, medication, and including vaccination, all this being opposed, right? And the opposite to all these claims, like, it might be possible to claim that the pandemic could have been avoided. But of course, in the actual evolution of the event, it has been the disaster for the humankind. Right? And at this point, I also try to argue that it also indicates the limits of the Chinese model, or limit of putting China in a comparative perspective, because China is deeply integrated into world capitalism. Therefore, what it can do is limited. Right? Now, in terms of coping with the pandemic, now in the conference paper, I try to present that tomorrow or the day after. I also try to look at this, the limit of what the Chinese model of political economy, when it comes to, because of its deep integration into the world markets, that is to say, in relation to what we have just talked about, that domestically, China is a mixed economy nowadays, with private investment accounting for typically about 2/3 of the total. So the law of value, or the profit orientation, has become of fundamental importance in the Chinese economy. And of course, it's always a matter of conflict between different orientations. And also in the external fronts, the pressure for China to go for financialization has always been there, which I try to argue is the main reason for China's the continuous economic growth slowdowns, or the so-called new normal. Right. So what I try to highlight is that, therefore, we need to broaden our vision to take into considerations of the international or broader world systematic dynamics, right? And putting China in this context. And I believe this is exactly the main orientation of the consideration of Elias and Salam's the presentations, right? That the interaction between China and other countries, say between China and Brazil, or between China and the Middle East, need to be seen in the broader context of the world political economic orders and its crisis. Right? Now, to put this in context, we just a simple measurement, right? That if we look at the per capita GDP at current price in market exchange rate, now the world, right? The world excluding China and excluding OECD, Now the per capita GDP as a ratio to OECD, it was 12% in the year 1980. By the year 2020, it was 10%. So all the promises surrounding the buzzwords of the convergence, that has never happened. If anything, divergence is the reality under neoliberal globalization. That all the promises of the policy doctrines of Washington consensus, new classical economics, promise that if you integrate yourself into the world markets, you'll be embarking on the natural path of development, convergence to the income level of the advanced countries. That has not happened. And of course, in contrast, the same measure, China in the year 1980, it was 3%, the level of OECD. By the year 2020, it's 30%. Right? So the tenfold, right? The only the major economy that has undergone such a process. Now, development failure under US-led neoliberal globalization. Why? Right. Now that we can identify monetary and technology monopoly are the main reasons. But this in peaceful times implies the massive transfer of economic surplus from the rest of the world, in particular from the developing world to the advanced countries. And in the time of crisis, the developing world bear the burdens of the crisis generated by these international systems. And it also the monopoly over technology and over finance, the hegemony of the dollar, all this makes it exceedingly difficult for developing countries to get away from the US-dominated world. And in fact, one telling example is that we have just seen the expansion of the BRICS, and one important issue in the discussion of the BRICS is the concerning possible way of reducing the dependence on the dollar hegemony, right? That presumably should be beneficial for most developing countries. But then we note that one country that should have been a natural candidate for joining the BRICS, but it has not. That is Indonesia. Right? It's with the fourth biggest population in the world, and definitely a developing economy, right? But it has not applied for joining, and for many reasons, but mainly its position in the existing international system. Right? We can see the opposition to joining the BRICS by the military, right? By the significant proportion of the capitalist class, right? And because of that, the interest being deeply integrated into the existing system, right? Now, to put it another way, if we want to consider whether or not China could serve as a countervailing force vis-a-vis the existing dynamics of the existing US-led neoliberal globalization of the existing world system, then we need to consider to what extent or if it's possible at all, China could contribute to the promotion of productive investment in the developing world, and to what extent or to whether or not China could contribute to technological developments. Technological development, we can think of what Rhys Jenkins has mentioned, China investing in the production of the electrical vehicles, right, in developing countries, and in fact also in Europe, right, nowadays. And the latest the story, of course, Huawei has just turned up a new cell phones with the chips that's the 100% domestic technology capable of 5G communication and also satellite communication. And of course, I have been mentioning that some people on the left claim that China with technological development is increasingly resembling capitalism, imperialism, right? That China developing technology, say such as Huawei's case, makes it in the position as imperialism, right? But that's quite dubious arguments, right? That the technology development in China, numerous examples have indicated when China developed this competitive technology that largely undermines the monopoly or hegemony of the advanced countries, largely reducing the cost and the price of the products available to the developing world. That there was the study by the UNTAC some years ago that the Chinese machinery, I think it's construction machinery, like typically was 1/3 of the price of the Japanese and German products, and also of more appropriate technology for developing countries, say the less sensitive to the instability of electricity supply. Right? And so this is just examples of what we need to have a systematic investigation whether, to what extent, in what way China could promote technological development in the developing world. And then most importantly, any possibility of alternative finance, right? That in the world whereby the monopoly over technology, and even more so a monopoly over finance, have been weaponized by the advanced country, by the US in particular, right? That whether or not China and the grouping, say BRICS or other possible groupings in connection with China, whether or not they could provide an alternative to the dollar hegemony that needs, well, again, investigation. All this said, still that there is no, when it comes back to China, there is no guarantee that the orientation and the capability of China would be working in the way to promote all these beneficial effects for the developing world. What I'll just say is that up until now, it is that there is evidence to suggest that China has been moving in this direction. But China itself is undergoing fundamental transformation. It's a mixed system with competing political economic interests, right? Those siding with the advanced countries, in the traditional Chinese political economic terminology, comprado capitalist or parasitic speculative capitals, as opposed to national bourgeoisie, or as opposed to the socialist elements of the Chinese political economy. All this could be in the process of conflicts, and that would determine the outcomes of what the position of the contribution of China, or the impact of China on world development, and vice versa. Of course, what's going on in the broader world will have fundamental impacts on China itself. I myself have been very pessimistic of what the Western left could and would do, but I'm more optimistic about what's happening in the global South. So that's what I have to say. Thanks.
To end. So this is the end of our workshop today. Thank you for joining us and staying till the end. So tomorrow we start the conference First one will be Salam's panel as well. Is it in this room? I think it's 9 a.m. And then in the afternoon, it is book launch of Radical Desai's book. So 2:45 in this room. And then we will have the online version as well. So thank you for coming. Have a nice evening.
Thank you very much.